Welcome to this tutorial on producing H.264 files for flash distribution with Apple Compressor. Let's start with some preliminaries. I shot this video, a concert of a local group called Loose Strings, in progressive mode because I shot it primarily for distribution over the internet. I shot it in widescreen DV mode, 16:9. Final Cut Pro calls that anamorphic. And I'm going to distribute via flash. I want to use the H.264 codec. I would prefer producing a file with an F4V extension, but Compressor can't do that. Compressor can produce a file with an MOV extension, a QuickTime file, which works fine for flash distribution, and that's what we'll do. I'm going to distribute this via progressive download, not streaming, which means I'm going to produce using variable bitrate encoding, not constant bitrate encoding. In terms of workflow, I'm going to produce a QuickTime reference movie from Final Cut Pro that frees up Final Cut Pro for additional work, then input that file into Compressor, set my encoding parameters, save the preset, and start encoding. Now when I produce my QuickTime reference movie, I'm going to produce it using the same settings option. So let's see what settings are in my sequence here, because that will control the output parameters of the file we're producing. So here's the sequence setting, and it's a 720 by 480 file, anamorphic DV. And this is the format that Final Cut Pro is going to produce when it produces the QuickTime reference movie. To do that, let's say File, Export, QuickTime Movie. I want to use current settings. Those are the settings we saw just a moment ago. I do not want to make the movie self-contained. Because it's a cuts-only edit, what Final Cut Pro will do when producing the QuickTime reference movie is point to the captured file and produce a separate audio file. And that's why it takes a few moments to get done. Let's call this Loose Strings QuickTime reference movie. Click Save. Drag this back in. And again, because it's only producing the audio file and creating pointers to the original video file, the process is very fast. That's one of the reasons we like producing QuickTime reference movies and not making them self-contained. So we've got our file. Let's tab over to Compressor and let's input the file. Now we're in Compressor, and it's time to start creating our encoding parameters. What I like to do when I'm producing a new settings file in Compressor is to start with the settings file that's a little bit bigger than the target that I'm going to produce, apply that, and then modify it as needed. So QuickTime 7 compatible gives us the H.264 option, so let's drag that into the settings window. And this is the setting that we're going to modify and then save off as a separate setting for later use. Click here to open up the settings file in the inspector window. Here's a summary window, and let's jump right in. As I spoke about before, the file format's going to be QuickTime Movie, which gives us an MOV extension. Video settings file. We start out with H.264. That's the codec that we want. Frame rate we don't want to change. We shot at 29.97 frames per second, and that's the number of frames we want in the final encoded file. In terms of keyframes, we want to choose automatic, which tells Compressor to insert a keyframe at regular intervals, but also at any scene changes. Compressor gives you two choices, main or baseline. You want to use the baseline profile when you're producing for devices like the iPod, and then you want to use the main profile when you're producing for computer playback, as we are here. The way you choose between that is with the frame reordering. Frame reordering off is baseline profile. Frame reordering on is main profile. We're going to set the data rate at 600 kilobits per second, which should be fine at the resolution we're going to produce at. And notice that when I inserted data rate up here, the quality slider becomes gray. So once we click this option and say 600 kilobits per second, it's going to produce to that data rate whatever quality it can produce you get, and the quality slider becomes essentially inactive. And then you have two options here. Best quality, which is a multipass encoding, takes a lot longer but does give you better quality, or faster encode, which you would only use when you're producing for draft work. We talked about the VBR versus CBR, the constant bitrate encoding versus variable bitrate encoding. When you use optimized for download, you're telling Compressor to produce using variable bitrate encoding. When you say optimized for streaming, that's where you get constant bitrate encoding. Because we're producing for progressive download, we're going to use optimized for download. Those are the video settings. Audio settings are simple. I want to use AAC. I want to use stereo because I'm producing music. If I was producing a talking head, I would use mono. I'll use the recommended rate, move this to best quality, not sure it makes much of a difference, but might as well dial that in, and then 128 kilobits per second for stereo audio should be fine. Okay, in terms of streaming options, if I was streaming via a QuickTime streaming server, I would go hinted streaming. I'm not doing that. If I was using this for progressive download to the QuickTime player, I would say fast start compressed header. Some of the Flash players have had trouble dealing with the compressed header with the fast start file. So if you're producing for Flash as we are here, I would say fast start no compressed header. So just use the fast start option. And now let's just check our preview and see where we are. We've got, here's our original source video. And this video is looking pretty funky. And what you're seeing is that Compressor is smushing the 16:9 video into a 4:3 window. So let's go fix that right now. And we're going to do that in the geometry pane. So in the geometry pane, we're going to say we don't want 640 by 480. We're going to dial in the custom 16:9 preset, and then 640 by 360 is what we want. And if we click over here and then back over here, we see that the aspect ratio is now correct. So that looks good. And pixel aspect ratio of 1 is what you always want when you're producing for streaming. Okay, nothing in filters. We're not going to set any filters here. We did all that in Final Cut Pro. If we were going to deinterlace, we would do that in the frames control pane, which we'll visit now. Okay, we could go with frame controls off, but the resize filter is set to better, not best. I'm not sure it makes a huge difference, but I would go in here, select on, and then set this to the best. Now we want the output fields to be same as source, because the source is progressive. We shouldn't have any deinterlacing going on. If we had a file that needed deinterlacing, if we had an interlaced file, better would give you very, very good quality, not the best quality, but the production time would be pretty reasonable. If you go to best, you get what's called optical flow, which is the highest quality deinterlacing that I've seen, short of some very expensive third-party tools, but it's very, very, very slow. So if you're going to deinterlace, try this. If you see some jaggies that you don't like, try this, but be prepared for some very lengthy encoding times. Again, deinterlacing isn't an issue here for us, so I'll just close this. Leave adaptive details checked. The anti-alias sliders and detail sliders only work when you're zooming video out rather than scaling video down, which is what we're doing here. So we're going to just leave these alone. Okay, so we've kind of gotten the setting to where we want it. Now let's save the setting. And let's call this 640 by 360 preset H.264 for Flash. That should about cover it. And this is the guy right here. Okay, so now we're ready to encode the file. You click Submit here. Now, this computer has QMaster enabled. QMaster gives you faster encoding when you've got a multi-core processor or multiple processors. So I'm going to elect that, and that's the Mac Pro cluster. And then I'm going to click Submit again, and the file starts encoding. And that's how you produce an H.264 file for Flash distribution with Apple Compressor.